The fluorescent lights in the Brazos County Sheriff's Department flickered at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning in March 2024, casting irregular shadows across Detective Marcus Chen's desk. He'd been staring at the same photograph for 20 minutes. A young woman with auburn hair and green eyes, frozen at 23 years old forever. Aurora Kelly. The name had become a ghost in this building, whispered in hallways during shift changes, referenced in training sessions about unsolved cases. A reminder of failure that had haunted 3 different sheriffs across 23 years. Marcus had been 7 years old when Aurora disappeared. He remembered the missing person posters plastered on every telephone pole in Bryan, Texas, her face smiling out from grocery store bulletin boards and gas station windows. His mother had gripped his hand tighter when they walked to school that autumn, her usual cheerfulness replaced by a vigilant silence that made the morning air feel heavier. Now, holding the DNA analysis report that had arrived via encrypted email at 6:15 a.m., Marcus felt his hands trembling. The coffee in his mug had gone cold an hour ago. Outside his office window, the early morning sky was turning from deep purple to pale gray, and he could hear the first birds beginning their chorus. Somewhere in this town of 60,000 people, someone was waking up with no idea that their entire world was about to collapse. "You're here early." The voice belonged to Sheriff Patricia Odoms, a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. She stood in his doorway with her own coffee, steam rising from the mug that read "World's Okayest Sheriff," a gift from her grandson. "Couldn't sleep," Marcus said, which was true. The Cody's hit came through. Aurora Kelly. Patricia's face changed. She set her coffee down carefully on the corner of his desk and closed the door behind her. "Tell me." DNA from the clothing fibers. The ones recovered from her apartment back in 2001. The lab in Austin reprocessed them with the new technology, the MVAC system that pulls DNA from fabric that traditional methods miss. Marcus pulled up the digital file on his screen. "We got a familial match 3 months ago. I've been working with the genealogy consultant to build the family tree." "Patricia, I know who it is." The sheriff sat down heavily in the chair across from him. 23 years. She'd been a rookie deputy when Aurora vanished. One of the officers who'd canvassed the neighborhood, knocked on doors, handed out flyers. "Who?" Marcus turned the screen toward her. The name at the top of the genealogical chart made Patricia's breath catch. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible. I've triple-checked everything. Had the state lab verify. Got a warrant for a DNA sample last week, using a discarded coffee cup. Direct match. 99.9% certainty." Marcus's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his exhaustion and something else. A deep, cold anger that had been building for 3 months. It's been him this whole time. Living here, walking these streets, shopping at the same H-E-B, eating at the same restaurants. Everyone thinking he's... "Stop." Patricia held up her hand. "I need to call the DA. We need to do this right. If we mess up the arrest, if there's any procedural error, he walks." She stood, pacing to the window. The sun was rising now, painting the parking lot in shades of gold and amber. Aurora's mother, Dorothy. She still lives on Broadmoor Drive. Same house. "I know," Marcus said quietly. "I drive past it sometimes. She keeps the porch light on. Every night for 23 years. Patricia turned back to him. "How many people know?" "Just us. The lab technicians are bound by confidentiality. The genealogist signed an NDA. I haven't even told my wife." Marcus pulled out another folder, this one thick with papers. "I've been building the case. Timeline. Witness statements from 2001. New interviews with people who knew Aurora. Financial records. Cell tower data from back when that technology was new. Everything connects. The opportunity, the access, the inconsistencies in his original statement." The sheriff picked up the photograph of Aurora Kelly. It had been taken at her college graduation from Texas A&M, 3 months before she disappeared. She wore a maroon cap and gown, her smile radiant, her whole life spreading out before her like an endless highway. She'd been a social work major, had dreams of opening a counseling center for at-risk youth. Her apartment had been found unlocked on October 15, 2001. Her purse on the kitchen counter, her car in the parking lot, her phone charged and sitting on her nightstand. No signs of struggle. No blood. No body. Just gone. For 6 months, the community had searched. Volunteers combed through every wooded area within 50 miles. Divers checked every lake and pond. Cadaver dogs worked until their paws bled. The FBI had gotten involved, bringing resources and expertise, but even they had eventually moved on to other cases, other missing women, other families trapped in the purgatory of not knowing. In 2003, a hiker had found bones in a ravine 30 miles outside of Bryan, scattered by animals and weather. Dental records confirmed what everyone had feared and, in some terrible way, hoped for closure. Aurora Kelly was dead. Had been dead, likely, since the day she disappeared. The manner of death was ruled as homicide due to evidence of trauma to the skull, but the case had gone cold. No suspects, no witnesses, no justice. Until now. When do we move? Patricia asked. Today. This morning. Before word gets out. Marcus stood, straightening his tie. I've coordinated with Bryan PD. We'll need their SWAT team for the arrest. I'm not taking chances. We serve the warrant at 8 a.m. That gives us an hour to brief the team. Patricia nodded slowly. You know what this is going to do to this town. I know. People are going to say we're wrong. That it's impossible. That we've made a mistake. Let them say it. Marcus's jaw tightened. Aurora Kelly deserves justice. Her mother deserves to know the truth. And he deserves to face what he did. The name hung between them, unspoken but deafening in its implications. Because the man whose DNA matched the evidence, the man who would be arrested in less than 2 hours, wasn't some drifter or stranger. He was woven into the fabric of this community. He was someone people trusted, someone they respected, someone who had attended Aurora's memorial service and hugged her weeping mother and told everyone who would listen that they needed to find who did this terrible thing. Marcus gathered his files, his badge, his weapon. The sun was fully up now, spilling through the windows of the sheriff's department, promising another hot Texas day. Somewhere in Bryan, in a comfortable house with a well-maintained lawn and an American flag hanging from the porch, a man was pouring his morning coffee, completely unaware that the walls he'd built around his secret were about to come crashing down. The photo of Aurora Kelly went into Marcus's folder. He'd need it for the press conference that would inevitably follow. But before he closed it, he looked at her face one more time. 23 years old, frozen in time, her smile carrying dreams that would never be fulfilled, potential that had been stolen in an act of violence that someone had hidden for 2 decades. We're coming for you, Marcus whispered to the photograph. Though he wasn't talking to Aurora, he was talking to her killer. Today it ends. Aurora Kelly had been the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday. Not just remembered, she planned. She'd show up at your dorm room at midnight with a cupcake and a candle, singing off-key but with such genuine joy that you couldn't help but laugh. Her roommate, Jessica Chen, now Jessica Morrison, married with 3 kids and living in Houston, still kept the birthday cards Aurora had made her, hand-drawn with markers and filled with inside jokes and encouraging words. She had this way of making you feel seen. Jessica would tell Detective Marcus, her younger cousin, small world, during one of their conversations in January 2024, when the case was beginning to heat up again. They sat in Jessica's kitchen while her children played in the next room, and she pulled out a shoebox filled with memories. Like really seen. Not just, hi, how are you seen? She'd remember that you mentioned your grandmother was sick 3 weeks ago and ask for an update. She'd notice if you seemed off and wouldn't let it go until you talked to her. Aurora had grown up in Bryan, the only child of Dorothy and Michael Kelly. Her father had died when she was 16. A heart attack while mowing the lawn on a Saturday afternoon in July. Aurora had been the one to find him, had called 911, had performed CPR she'd learned in a babysitting class until the paramedics arrived. It hadn't been enough. That loss had shaped her, but it hadn't broken her. Instead, it had seemed to make her more determined to help others, to be present in moments of crisis, to show up when people needed someone. At Texas A&M, she'd volunteered at the crisis hotline, taking calls on Friday and Saturday nights when other students were out partying. She'd sit in a small office in the counseling center with a headset and a notepad, talking people through their darkest moments. Her supervisor, Dr. Helen Reeves, remembered her as one of the best volunteers they'd ever had. Most students did it for their resume or to fulfill service hours. Dr. Reeves told Marcus during an interview at her office on campus, now filled with 23 more years of books and credentials. She was in her 70s now, semi-retired but still teaching one class per semester. Aurora did it because she genuinely cared. I remember one night, it must have been 2 in the morning. I came in to drop off some files and she was still there. Her shift had ended at midnight, but she'd stayed late because a caller was in crisis and she didn't want to transfer them to someone new. That was who she was. Aurora's daily routine in the fall of 2001 had been structured but full. She'd wake at 6:30 a.m. in the apartment she shared with Jessica on Texas Avenue, a 2-bedroom in an older complex with thin walls and a pool that was always slightly too cold. She'd go for a run, 3 miles, the same route every morning, past the neighborhoods of small houses with chain-link fences and barking dogs, down to the park where old men played dominoes at concrete tables. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She'd shower, dress in whatever thrift store finds she'd assembled into an outfit that somehow always looked intentional, and head to campus. Classes in the morning, advanced clinical practice, trauma-informed care, group therapy dynamics. Lunch at the MSC food court, usually the same thing, a bean and cheese burrito with extra salsa and a Dr. Pepper. Afternoons were for her internship at the local family counseling center, where she was working with families in crisis, learning to navigate the complex dynamics of abuse, addiction, and poverty. Evenings varied. Sometimes she'd study at the library, her textbook spread across an entire table, highlighters in multiple colors marking passages about attachment theory and cognitive behavioral therapy. Sometimes she'd attend meetings for the service organizations she belonged to, the Social Work Student Association, the Crisis Intervention Team, a women's mentorship program she'd helped start, and sometimes, more often than her mother would have liked, she'd drive out to visit clients from the counseling center who lived in the poorer areas outside Bryan. She'd bring groceries, help fill out paperwork for government assistance programs, sit and listen to their stories. Her supervisor had told her it wasn't appropriate, that there needed to be boundaries, but Aurora had a hard time with boundaries when she saw people struggling. She had this thing about injustice, Jessica said, running her finger along the edge of a photograph from their junior year. It physically bothered her. Like, she'd see something unfair and she couldn't let it go. There was this guy in our apartment complex. Older guy, veteran, had PTSD, and the landlord was trying to evict him over some bullshit noise complaint. Aurora went full lawyer mode. She researched tenant rights, contacted legal aid, showed up at the office every day until they backed off. She barely knew the guy. That was just who she was. Aurora had contradictions like everyone else. She was confident in her convictions but insecure about her appearance. She'd spend an hour getting ready for a night out, trying on different outfits, asking Jessica's opinion repeatedly. She was brilliant in her classes but terrible with money, constantly overdrawing her checking account and having to call her mother for emergency loans. She preached self-care but survived on too much caffeine and too little sleep. She loved poetry, particularly Mary Oliver and Maya Angelou, and would quote lines in the middle of conversations, making connections between life and literature that sometimes worked and sometimes fell flat. She kept a journal, a leather-bound book she'd bought at a bookstore in Austin during spring break, and she wrote in it almost every night before bed. That journal had never been found. Her dreams were specific and ambitious. She wanted to open a counseling center specifically for teenagers who'd experienced trauma. She'd already picked out the name Phoenix House and had started sketching ideas for how it would work: free or sliding scale fees, trauma-trained counselors, art therapy, group sessions, a safe space decorated to feel like a home, not an institution. She talked about it constantly, working on the business plan as part of an independent study project her senior year. She was going to change things, Dorothy Kelly said during one of Marcus's visits to her home, the same home where Aurora had grown up, where her bedroom remained exactly as it had been in 2001. Dorothy was 71 now, her hair white, her hands marked with age spots, but her eyes still sharp. She was going to make this world better. I know every mother thinks that about their child, but with Aurora, people were drawn to her. She had this light. Dorothy's house was a shrine and a tomb. Aurora's softball trophies from middle school still lined the mantel. Her high school graduation photo hung in the hallway. The porch light that Patricia had mentioned. Dorothy turned it on every evening at sunset and turned it off at sunrise. A beacon that had burned for 8,395 nights. A ritual of hope and grief intertwined. "I keep thinking she'll come home," Dorothy admitted. And it wasn't the first time she'd said it. "I know she's gone. I buried her. But sometimes I hear a car door close and I think, maybe it was all a mistake. Maybe she's been in a hospital somewhere with amnesia, or maybe she was kidnapped and held somewhere and she finally escaped and she's coming home." She paused, tears streaming down her face. "Is that crazy?" "It's not crazy," Marcus had told her, and he'd meant it. "It's love." Aurora's friends from college had scattered across Texas and beyond. Some still lived in the Bryan College Station area, had built careers and families here. Others had moved to Dallas, Houston, Austin, chasing opportunities and trying to outrun memories. But they all remembered her. When Marcus tracked them down for interviews, reopening old wounds in service of new evidence, they all said variations of the same thing. Aurora had made them want to be better people. There was Miguel Santos, who'd been in Aurora's clinical practice class. He was a licensed therapist now, working in Houston with refugee families. "She had this way of asking questions that made you really think," he said during a phone interview. "Not judgmental questions, but curious ones. Like, what would it mean if you believed you were worth loving? That kind of thing. She asked me that once, and it changed my whole perspective." There was Rachel Nguyen, who'd worked with Aurora at the crisis hotline. She'd gone on to medical school and was now a psychiatrist in Austin. "I remember this one call we took together. It was a training exercise where we were supposed to co-counsel. The caller was a young woman who'd been assaulted and was having suicidal thoughts. Aurora was so calm, so present. She didn't try to fix it or minimize it. She just held space for this person's pain and helped her find one reason to stay alive for one more day." After the call, Aurora went to the bathroom and cried for 20 minutes. She felt everything so deeply. There was Brandon Cole, who'd been Aurora's boyfriend briefly during their sophomore year. The relationship had lasted 3 months before they'd mutually decided they were better as friends. Brandon was a high school teacher now in San Antonio, married with twin daughters. "Aurora saw potential in everyone," he said, "sometimes to her own detriment. She'd give people second and third and fourth chances when they probably didn't deserve it. She believed people could change. I think that might have been what got her killed. She trusted someone she shouldn't have." The question that had haunted the investigation from the beginning was simple. Who would want to hurt Aurora Kelly? She didn't have enemies. She didn't owe anyone money. She wasn't involved in drugs or any dangerous activities. Her ex-boyfriend had an alibi. He'd been at a wedding in Dallas the weekend she disappeared. Her family relationships were solid. Her friendships were healthy. The original investigators had explored every angle. They'd looked at other volunteers from the crisis hotline, wondering if someone had become obsessed with her. They'd interviewed everyone who lived in her apartment complex, everyone in her classes, everyone at her internship site. They'd examined her phone records, her email, her bank statements. They'd found nothing suspicious. What they had found was that Aurora had been planning to confront someone. Jessica remembered a conversation they'd had about a week before Aurora disappeared. Aurora had been agitated, pacing their apartment, ranting about people who abuse their power and systems that protect predators. She'd mentioned something about her internship, about seeing something that wasn't right, about needing to report it but being afraid of the consequences. "I asked her what she was talking about," Jessica told Marcus, her voice heavy with guilt that had accumulated over 23 years. "She said she couldn't tell me yet, that she needed to be sure before she said anything to anyone official. She said she was going to give this person a chance to do the right thing first. I told her that sounded dangerous. She laughed and said she'd be fine, that she was always careful. The Monday before she disappeared, Aurora had called her mother. Dorothy remembered the conversation because Aurora had sounded stressed, which was unusual. She'd said something about a difficult situation at work and asked her mother what she would do if she knew someone was doing something wrong, but telling the truth would hurt innocent people. "I told her to trust her gut," Dorothy said, her voice breaking. "I told her that the truth always matters, even when it's hard. What if that's what got her killed? What if my advice—" "Don't," Marcus had interrupted gently. "You can't think like that." But the question remained. What had Aurora known? What had she seen? Who had she been planning to confront? The internship site where she'd been working was a family counseling center called Haven House, a nonprofit that provided therapy and support services to families in crisis. The director in 2001 had been a man named Thomas Bradshaw, a licensed clinical social worker with 15 years of experience. He'd been interviewed extensively after Aurora's disappearance. He described her as an exemplary intern, enthusiastic and committed. He'd said she'd never expressed any concerns to him about anything inappropriate happening at the center. He'd attended her memorial service. He'd donated money to the scholarship fund established in her name. Thomas Bradshaw had an alibi for the weekend Aurora disappeared. He'd been at a professional conference in San Antonio with dozens of witnesses. His wife confirmed he'd come home Sunday evening and had been distraught when he heard about Aurora's disappearance on Monday morning. He'd cooperated fully with the investigation, provided DNA samples, which hadn't matched anything at the time because the technology to extract usable DNA from fabric fibers had been limited in 2001, and offered any resources his organization could provide to help find Aurora. For 23 years, Thomas Bradshaw had been considered a concerned supervisor whose intern had met a tragic fate. He'd continued his career in social work, eventually becoming a regional director for a statewide nonprofit. He'd served on boards and committees. He'd been honored with awards for his service to vulnerable populations. He'd lived his life as a respected professional and community member. Until Marcus Chun received an encrypted email at 6:15 a.m. on a Thursday morning in March 2024, containing DNA analysis results that would rewrite everything everyone thought they knew. The arrest happened at 8:13 a.m. on March 14, 2024, at a modest two-story house on Elm Street in a quiet neighborhood where children rode bikes and neighbors knew each other's names. Thomas Bradshaw was in his kitchen pouring a second cup of coffee when he heard the knock. Loud, authoritative, unmistakable. He'd been scrolling through the news on his tablet, reading about the upcoming city council election, thinking about whether he needed to water the azaleas in the front yard. When he opened the door, he saw Detective Marcus Chun flanked by 4 SWAT team members in tactical gear. Behind them, 3 marked police units blocked the street, their lights painting the morning in red and blue. "Thomas Bradshaw," Marcus said, his voice level and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You're under arrest for the murder of Aurora Kelly. Put your hands where I can see them." The look on Bradshaw's face was one Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Not guilt, not fear, confusion. Pure, apparently genuine confusion. What are you? There must be some mistake. Aurora Kelly? That was 20 years ago. I didn't. Hands. Now. One of the SWAT officers moved forward and Bradshaw complied, his coffee mug forgotten on the entry table where it would later be photographed as evidence of normalcy interrupted. The handcuffs clicked closed. Miranda rights were read. A search warrant was executed. Bradshaw's wife, Ellen, appeared at the top of the stairs in a bathrobe, her face pale with shock. Their adult daughter, Rachel, who'd been visiting from Dallas with her 2 young children, stood frozen in the hallway, holding her 3-year-old son on her hip. "Dad." Rachel's voice was small, childlike. "What's happening?" "It's a mistake," Bradshaw said, his voice rising. "It's a terrible mistake. Ellen, call Gerald. Call Gerald right now." Gerald Hoffman was Thomas Bradshaw's attorney, a friend from law school who'd handled his will and his real estate transactions. Within the hour, Gerald would be at the police station, and within 2 hours, he'd be recommending a criminal defense attorney with experience in high-profile murder cases. As Marcus led Bradshaw to the patrol car, neighbors emerged onto their porches. Sharon McKenzie, who lived 2 houses down and had known the Bradshaws for 18 years, watched with her hand over her mouth. Raj Patel, who'd carpooled with Thomas to community board meetings, stood in his driveway holding his car keys, unable to process what he was seeing. Martha and William Sung, the elderly couple across the street who'd received countless kindnesses from Thomas over the years, help with yard work, rides to medical appointments, friendly conversation, stood holding hands, their faces etched with disbelief. The local news vans arrived within 45 minutes. By noon, the story was regional. By evening, it was national. Respected social worker arrested in 23-year-old cold case murder. Texas man charged with killing intern he supervised in 2001. DNA evidence cracks cold case. Social work director accused of murder. The Bryan College Station community erupted. The morning of the arrest, the sheriff's department phone lines were overwhelmed. People called to say there must be a mistake. People called to say they'd always known something was off about Bradshaw. People called to share theories, accusations, support, and rage. At Haven House, the family counseling center where Aurora had interned and where Thomas had worked for 12 years before moving to the regional office, staff members gathered in the conference room in stunned silence. Jennifer Walsh, the current director who'd started as a counselor 5 years after Aurora's death, stood at the window watching the news crews set up across the street. "This doesn't make sense," said Marcus Reeves, no relation to Detective Chun, a therapist who'd worked with Bradshaw for 8 years. "Tom Bradshaw? Tom? The guy who organizes the annual fundraiser for foster kids? The guy who mentored me through my clinical hours? No, absolutely not." But Yolanda Martinez, who'd been a case manager at Haven House since 1999 and had known Aurora, sat quietly at the conference table, her face unreadable. After a long moment, she spoke. "I always wondered." Everyone turned to look at her. "Wondered what?" Jennifer asked carefully. "About Tom and Aurora. The way he talked about her. It was, I don't know, too much, too invested." Yolanda folded her hands on the table. "She was just an intern, you know? But he'd bring her up constantly. Aurora said this, Aurora did that. He'd assign her to his personal cases instead of distributing the interns equally among supervisors. He'd call her into his office for supervision meetings that lasted 2 hours. That's not evidence of murder, Marcus protested. That's a supervisor being attentive to an intern's development. Maybe, Yolanda said. But when she disappeared, the way he acted at her memorial, I don't know how to describe it. It was like he was performing grief. And then he donated all that money to her scholarship fund, $10,000. That's a lot for a nonprofit director's salary. It felt like guilt money. You never said anything, Jennifer said quietly. What was there to say? Tom seems too sad about a dead intern. I didn't have proof of anything. Just a feeling. Yolanda stood, gathering her things. Besides, police interviewed all of us back then. He had an alibi. He passed a polygraph. What was I supposed to do? This conversation, and thousands like it, rippled through Bryan over the following weeks. People took sides. Marriages were tested. Friendships ended. Church congregations split over whether to support Thomas Bradshaw or condemn him. At First Baptist Church, where the Bradshaws had attended for 20 years, the congregation was in turmoil. Thomas had served as a deacon, had taught Sunday school, had led mission trips to build houses in Mexico. Pastor David Wilson called an emergency meeting of church leadership. We need to be very careful here, the pastor said, looking around at the 8 elders and deacons assembled in his office. Thomas Bradshaw is innocent until proven guilty. That's not just a legal principle, it's a moral one. Pastor, with respect, we're talking about murder, said Elder Margaret Chen, Marcus's aunt. Another small world connection. The DNA evidence. DNA evidence can be wrong. Tests can be contaminated. Mistakes happen. Or, said Deacon Linda Freeman, her voice sharp, Tom Bradshaw has been lying to all of us for 23 years, living a double life. Coming to church, teaching our children, serving communion, all while knowing he killed a young woman. If that's true, Pastor, we need to reckon with the fact that we all missed it. That we trusted a monster. The word monster hung in the air like a curse. Thomas Bradshaw's bond hearing happened 3 days after his arrest. The courtroom was packed with supporters and protesters. Dorothy Kelly sat in the front row behind the prosecutor, flanked by family members and victim advocates. She'd aged a decade in 72 hours, her face gaunt with the resurrection of old grief mixed with something new, the possibility of justice. Bradshaw's defense attorney, Carla Richardson, a formidable woman from Houston with a reputation for taking on impossible cases, argued for reasonable bond. My client has lived in this community for 40 years. He has deep ties, a family, a career of service. He's not a flight risk. He's not a danger to the community. He maintains his innocence and looks forward to his day in court to clear his name. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney James Liu, stood to respond. James was in his mid-40s, had prosecuted dozens of murder cases, but there was something different about this one. The entire community was watching. The weight of history pressed down on every word. Your Honor, this isn't a case of someone who got into a bar fight or made a terrible mistake. This is cold, calculated murder. Aurora Kelly was 23 years old, with her whole life ahead of her. She trusted the defendant. He was her supervisor, her mentor. She was planning to report him for inappropriate conduct with clients. We have evidence of this now. Testimony from her roommate and mother about conversations she had the week before she died. The defendant used his position of power to lure her to a secondary location, killed her, and disposed of her body. He then attended her memorial service, donated money in her name, and lived freely while her mother kept a porch light on for 23 years hoping her daughter would come home. James's voice broke slightly on the last sentence, and he paused to collect himself. The DNA evidence is overwhelming. But more than that, we now have testimony from former employees at Haven House who witnessed the defendant's inappropriate obsession with Ms. Kelly. We have phone records showing multiple calls between the defendant and Ms. Kelly in the days before her death. We have financial records showing unexplained large cash withdrawals. And we have a community that deserves to know the truth about a man they trusted. Given the severity of the crime and the evidence against him, the state requests that the defendant be held without bond. Judge Andrea Martinez, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years on the bench, took less than 10 minutes to deliberate. Bond is set at $2 million. Defendant is remanded to custody. Ellen Bradshaw let out a sound. Not quite a sob, not quite a scream. Rachel, their daughter, wrapped her arms around her mother while her own husband stood behind them, his jaw clenched. In that moment, the Bradshaw family began their own nightmare, a different kind of grief, mourning someone who was still alive but who might be lost to them forever. As Thomas was led out of the courtroom, he turned to look at his family. I didn't do this, he mouthed. Ellen nodded, tears streaming down her face, wanting desperately to believe him. Dorothy Kelly didn't look at the Bradshaw family. She couldn't, because if she did, she might feel sympathy for them, and she needed all her strength to hold on to the hope that after 23 years of not knowing, not understanding, not being able to bury her daughter's killer along with her daughter, she might finally get answers. Over the following weeks, details emerged in waves, each revelation creating new earthquakes in the community. Detective Marcus Chun worked 18-hour days, building the prosecution's case, tracking down witnesses, re-interviewing people who'd been involved in the original investigation. A former counselor at Haven House, Bethany Rogers, came forward with information she'd been afraid to share in 2001. She'd quit the center 2 months before Aurora disappeared because she'd witnessed Thomas Bradshaw engaging in inappropriate relationships with vulnerable clients. Not sexual, or at least not provably so, but crossing boundaries in ways that made her uncomfortable. He'd give his personal phone number to attractive young female clients. He'd meet them for coffee outside of session. He'd loan them money and accept repayment in the form of help around the house. I reported it to the board, Bethany told Marcus during an interview at her home in Austin, where she now worked as a school counselor. They investigated, or they said they did. Tom gave explanations for everything. He said he was just being compassionate, going above and beyond for clients in crisis. The board gave him a warning about maintaining boundaries but didn't take any serious action. I was furious. I quit and moved to Austin. Why didn't you come forward when Aurora disappeared? Marcus asked, though he asked it gently. He knew the answer. Because I was afraid, Bethany admitted. Afraid people wouldn't believe me. Afraid of being sued for defamation. Afraid that Tom would somehow, I don't know. It sounds paranoid now, but he had this way of making problems disappear. People who questioned him suddenly found themselves reassigned or having their job performance called into question. And he had an alibi for the weekend Aurora died. Everyone said he couldn't have been involved. So I told myself I was wrong to suspect him. Another witness emerged, David Park, who'd been Aurora's advisor in the social work program at Texas A&M. He'd kept meticulous notes from his advising sessions, and when he heard about the arrest, he'd gone through his files from 2001. He found a note from a meeting with Aurora on October 8, 2001, 1 week before she disappeared. The note read, Aurora concerned about situation at internship site. Supervisor T. Bradshaw, engaging in inappropriate dual relationships with clients. Aurora witnessed him giving personal gifts to female client. Appears to be grooming behavior. Aurora wants to report to licensing board but worried about retaliation and impact on her future career. Advised her to document everything and discuss with internship coordinator. Aurora says she's going to confront Bradshaw first, give him chance to stop. Counseled her that this might not be safe. She insists it's the right thing to do. Marcus read the note 3 times, his hands shaking with rage and grief. Aurora had tried to do the right thing. She'd seen something wrong and tried to address it, and it had gotten her killed. The prosecution theory began to take shape. Thomas Bradshaw had been engaging in inappropriate relationships with clients, using his position of power to manipulate vulnerable women. Aurora had discovered this. She'd confronted him, probably telling him she was going to report him to the licensing board. He'd panicked. He'd somehow lured her to a meeting, perhaps under the guise of discussing the situation, maybe promising to stop, asking for a chance to explain. Instead, he'd killed her. The blow to her head had been significant enough to fracture her skull. Then he'd disposed of her body in the ravine where it would eventually be found, scattered by animals and weather. He'd gotten away with it for 23 years because the technology hadn't existed to extract his DNA from the fabric fibers found in Aurora's apartment. Fibers from a distinctive jacket he'd worn frequently in 2001, visible in dozens of photographs from that time period. The new MVAC technology had changed everything. As the evidence mounted, community divisions deepened. Haven House received death threats. Staff members were harassed at grocery stores. Someone spray-painted "Murderer's Workplace" across the front of the building. The organization had to hire security guards. Ellen Bradshaw lost her job at the elementary school where she had taught second grade for 15 years. Officially, it was a mutual decision to part ways during this difficult time. Unofficially, parents had started a petition demanding her removal, claiming they couldn't trust the wife of an accused murderer around their children. The fact that she'd had nothing to do with the crime, that she'd been at work in a different town the day Aurora disappeared, that she'd been married to Thomas for 37 years and was as shocked as anyone. None of it mattered. Rachel Bradshaw's husband, Kevin, filed for divorce 3 weeks after the arrest. He claimed it was unrelated, that they'd been having problems for months, but Rachel knew the truth. Kevin worked in commercial real estate, and his business partners had made it clear that being connected to the Bradshaw family was bad for the company's reputation. He'd chosen his career over his wife and children. At Texas A&M, the social work department held a vigil for Aurora. Dr. Helen Reeves, now 74 and still teaching that 1 class per semester, stood before current students and told them about the young woman who'd volunteered on the crisis hotline, who'd dreamed of opening Phoenix House, who'd believed that everyone deserved compassion and second chances. Aurora's murder teaches us something painful, Dr. Reeves said, her voice amplified through speakers to reach the 300 people gathered on the lawn outside the Memorial Student Center. Candles flickered in the evening breeze. It teaches us that sometimes the people we're supposed to trust, supervisors, mentors, authority figures, are the very ones we need protection from. Aurora saw something wrong and tried to address it. That courage cost her everything. We honor her memory by being willing to speak truth to power, even when it's dangerous, even when it costs us. Dorothy Kelly attended the vigil. She'd been invited to speak but couldn't manage it. Instead, she stood beside Detective Marcus Chen, who'd become something like a companion in her grief. The young man who'd finally brought her answers after 23 years of questions. "Do you think he'll confess?" Dorothy asked Marcus as they watched students light candles and embrace each other. "No," Marcus said honestly. "Men like him never do. They'll fight it to the end. He'll claim the DNA was contaminated, that the timeline doesn't work, that there's some other explanation. But we have him, Dorothy. The evidence is solid. Will that be enough for a jury?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. That was the question keeping him up at night. Bradshaw's defense team was already mounting a sophisticated campaign. They'd hired their own DNA experts who would testify about contamination risks. They'd dug up every witness from 2001 who'd said nice things about Bradshaw and would parade them before the jury. They'd point out that no one had actually seen Bradshaw with Aurora that weekend, that the conference alibi meant he couldn't have committed the murder during the commonly accepted timeline. The prosecution would have to prove that Bradshaw had killed Aurora either before he left for the conference or after he returned, narrowing the window in ways that would require circumstantial evidence and logical inferences. It was a strong case, but not airtight. Meanwhile, other victims began to emerge. Women who'd been clients at Haven House in the late 1990s and early 2000s started coming forward with stories of inappropriate behavior from Thomas Bradshaw. None of it rose to the level of sexual assault, or at least nothing they'd be willing to testify about in court. But a pattern emerged of a man who used his position to manipulate vulnerable women. Maria Gonzalez, now 48 and living in Houston, had been a client at Haven House in 1999 when she was going through a divorce and struggling with her 3 young children. Thomas Bradshaw had been her counselor. He'd been kind at first, helpful, encouraging. Then the boundaries had started to blur. He'd given her his cell phone number. He'd called to check on her outside of session times. He'd shown up at her apartment once, claiming he'd been in the neighborhood and wanted to make sure she was okay. It felt wrong, Maria told the investigator who interviewed her. But I was so vulnerable, and he was the only person who seemed to care. When he asked me to meet him for dinner, not at a restaurant but at his office after hours, I went. He said we needed to discuss my treatment plan. But when I got there, he had wine. He'd ordered takeout. He kept saying how special I was, how much he admired my strength. "Did anything physical happen?" the investigator asked. "He tried to kiss me. I pulled away and left. I never went back to Haven House. I was embarrassed and confused. Part of me wondered if I'd misread the situation, if I was being paranoid. He was this respected professional and I was just a broke single mom. Who would believe me?" 3 other women told similar stories. A pattern of grooming, boundary violations, and manipulation. None of them had reported it at the time because they blamed themselves, because they were afraid, because they assumed no one would believe them over a man with credentials and community standing. When the prosecutor's office reached out to these women about potentially testifying to establish pattern evidence, all but one declined. They didn't want their names public. They didn't want to be cross-examined by defense attorneys who would paint them as unstable, vindictive, or attention-seeking. They didn't want their families to know what had happened. Only Yolanda Martinez, the former Haven House case manager, agreed to testify about what she'd witnessed. But her testimony would be limited. She hadn't seen anything illegal, just unprofessional and ethically questionable behavior. The legal maneuvering began in earnest. Bradshaw's defense team filed motion after motion. They challenged the constitutionality of the warrant used to collect his DNA from the discarded coffee cup. They argued that the genealogical database search violated his privacy rights. They demanded access to all law enforcement files from 2001. They filed motions to exclude testimony from Aurora's roommate and mother about her concerns regarding Bradshaw, claiming it was hearsay. Judge Martinez ruled on each motion with careful attention to precedent. She allowed the DNA evidence, the warrant had been properly obtained. She allowed the genealogical search, courts had consistently upheld this investigative technique. She allowed some of the testimony about Aurora's concerns but limited its scope to avoid unfair prejudice. As summer arrived in Bryan, Texas, the case consumed the community. The Bryan College Station Eagle newspaper ran a multi-part series examining Haven House's history, board oversight failures, and systemic problems in social service organizations that allowed predatory behavior to go unchecked. The series won a regional journalism award but also sparked controversy. Some readers felt it was a necessary examination of institutional failures. Others felt it was a rush to judgment that assumed Bradshaw's guilt before trial. At Dorothy Kelly's house, the porch light continued to burn every night, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer a beacon hoping for Aurora's return. It had become something else, a memorial flame, a testament to stubborn persistence, a symbol that some mothers never stop seeking justice for their children. Detective Marcus Chen found himself becoming the public face of the investigation. He gave carefully worded interviews to local and national media. He attended community meetings where concerned citizens demanded answers. He worked with victim advocates to support Dorothy and Aurora's extended family, and he spent countless hours preparing for trial, knowing that any mistake, any overlooked detail, could allow a killer to walk free. One afternoon in July, Marcus drove out to the ravine where Aurora's remains had been found in 2003. It was a desolate place, 30 miles from Bryan, accessible only by a rough dirt road that wound through scrubland and mesquite trees. Wildlife had scattered her bones over a wide area. Dental records had provided positive identification, but there hadn't been much else to work with. Her clothing had deteriorated, animals had disturbed the scene, and years of Texas weather had erased most physical evidence. Marcus stood at the edge of the ravine, looking down at the rocky slope where a young woman's body had lain for 6 months before discovery, and he felt the weight of all those years pressing down on him. 23 years of Dorothy's porch light burning. 23 years of Thomas Bradshaw living freely, going to church, teaching Sunday school, receiving awards for his service. 23 years of injustice. "We're going to make this right," Marcus said aloud to the empty landscape, to Aurora's ghost, to the universe that had allowed evil to hide in plain sight for so long. "I promise you, we're going to make this right." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. Because he knew that in courtrooms, truth wasn't always enough. DNA evidence could be challenged. Witnesses could be discredited. Reasonable doubt could be manufactured by skilled attorneys with unlimited resources. And juries, 12 strangers pulled from the same community where Bradshaw had built a reputation over decades, might not be able to reconcile the respected social worker they thought they knew with the cold-blooded killer he allegedly was. The trial was set for October 2024, exactly 23 years after Aurora Kelly had disappeared from her apartment on a fall evening, leaving behind only questions and a mother's unquenchable hope for answers. As summer heat baked the Texas landscape and tensions simmered in Bryan, two families prepared for battle. The Kellys prepared to relive their worst trauma in public, to hear details about how Aurora died, to face her killer across a courtroom and demand accountability. The Bradshaws prepared to fight for Thomas's freedom, to maintain his innocence, to somehow prove that the DNA evidence was wrong, that 23 years of respected community service meant more than one cold case detective's theory. And in the middle of it all, Aurora Kelly remained frozen at 23 years old, her potential unrealized, her dreams unfulfilled, her voice speaking only through the memories of those who'd loved her and the evidence that had finally, after more than 2 decades, emerged from the shadows to accuse her killer. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The trial of Thomas Bradshaw began on October 15, 2024, 23 years to the day after Aurora Kelly disappeared. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the packed courtroom. Judge Andrea Martinez had expedited the trial date at the prosecution's request, and both sides had worked furiously through the summer preparing their cases. The jury selection had taken 3 days. Finding 12 Brazos County residents who hadn't already formed an opinion about Thomas Bradshaw proved nearly impossible. Every potential juror knew something about the case. Many had personal connections, they'd attended the same church, worked with him professionally, or had children in Ellen Bradshaw's 2nd grade class. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men ranging in age from 24 to 68. a retired postal worker, a shift manager at a chicken processing plant, a yoga instructor, an automotive technician, 2 homemakers, an accountant, a nurse, a university administrator, a construction foreman, a librarian, and a bank teller. Assistant District Attorney James Liu stood to deliver his opening statement. He was dressed in a dark gray suit, his manner professional but passionate. Behind him, on easels covered with white sheets, were enlarged photographs and exhibits that would tell Aurora Kelly's story. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about trust betrayed in the most horrific way imaginable. Aurora Kelly was 23 years old, brilliant, compassionate, dedicated to helping others. She was completing her master's degree in social work at Texas A&M, and she was doing her internship at Haven House under the supervision of the defendant, Thomas Bradshaw. James walked toward the defense table, where Bradshaw sat between his attorneys, Carla Richardson, and her co-counsel, Michael Torres. Bradshaw wore a navy suit and looked older than his 64 years, his face lined with stress and sleepless nights. Aurora trusted him. She looked up to him. He was her mentor, her supervisor, someone who was supposed to guide her professional development and protect her welfare. Instead, he killed her. James let the words hang in the air. He killed her because she was about to expose him for inappropriate conduct with vulnerable clients. She was going to report him to the state licensing board. Her career had barely begun, and she was already demonstrating the courage and integrity that would have made her an exceptional therapist. That courage got her killed. James returned to the prosecution table and uncovered the first exhibit, a photograph of Aurora from her college graduation, smiling, full of life. Beside it, he placed a photograph of her apartment building from 2001. On October 15, 2001, Aurora Kelly vanished. Her apartment was unlocked, her purse and phone left behind. No signs of struggle. For 6 months, her family searched desperately. Then, in April 2003, her remains were found in a ravine 30 miles from Bryan. She'd been murdered, blunt force trauma to the head. But there were no suspects. The case went cold. He paused, making eye contact with each juror. For 23 years, Thomas Bradshaw lived freely. He continued his career. He attended church. He received awards for his community service. And Aurora's mother, Dorothy Kelly, kept her porch light on every single night, hoping her daughter would somehow come home. James's voice strengthened. But science doesn't forget. DNA doesn't lie. In 2024, using new technology called the MVAC system, forensic technicians extracted DNA from fabric fibers found in Aurora's apartment, fibers from a distinctive jacket that the defendant wore regularly in 2001. The DNA is a perfect match. The odds of it being someone other than Thomas Bradshaw are less than 1 in 8 trillion. He uncovered another exhibit showing the DNA analysis results, the probability statistics highlighted in yellow. We will prove that Aurora Kelly discovered Thomas Bradshaw was engaging in inappropriate relationships with female clients. We will prove that she was planning to report him. We will prove that he killed her to silence her. And we will prove it beyond a reasonable doubt through DNA evidence, circumstantial evidence, and testimony from witnesses who will tell you about the defendant's pattern of boundary violations and his obsessive behavior toward Aurora in the weeks before her death. James returned to his seat. When you've heard all the evidence, you'll understand that justice delayed is not justice denied. After 23 years, Aurora Kelly will finally have her day in court. Carla Richardson stood for the defense. She was in her early 50s, with short silver hair and an intensity that commanded attention. She walked slowly toward the jury box, establishing eye contact with each person. My name is Carla Richardson, and I represent Thomas Bradshaw, an innocent man who has been wrongly accused of a horrific crime he did not commit. Her voice was calm but firm. The prosecution wants you to believe that DNA evidence is infallible, that it tells a complete story. But DNA doesn't tell you when those fibers got into Aurora's apartment. It doesn't tell you how. It doesn't prove murder. She gestured toward Bradshaw, who sat with his hands folded on the table, his expression carefully neutral. Thomas Bradshaw was Aurora Kelly's supervisor. Of course his DNA might be present in her apartment, He was her mentor, her teacher. He met with her regularly to review her casework. We don't dispute that Thomas knew Aurora. We don't dispute that he supervised her. What we dispute is that he killed her. Carla moved to her own exhibits, uncovering photographs of a conference center in San Antonio. On October 13, 2001, Thomas Bradshaw traveled to San Antonio for a professional conference. He was there with colleagues, attendees, and hotel staff who will testify that he was present throughout the weekend. He couldn't have killed Aurora Kelly because he wasn't even in Bryan when she disappeared. She let that sink in. The prosecution's timeline doesn't work. They'll try to claim he killed her before leaving for the conference or after returning. But Aurora was seen alive by multiple witnesses on Saturday, October 13th, while Thomas was already in San Antonio. And when he returned Sunday evening, his wife picked him up at the bus station. He was never alone, never unaccounted for. Carla's voice took on an edge. This case is about a rush to judgment. After 23 years with no suspect, law enforcement desperately wanted to close this case. When DNA technology advanced, they ran old evidence through databases looking for any match. They found Thomas's DNA that could have been deposited innocently during normal supervisor-intern interactions, and they built an entire theory around it without considering other explanations. She walked back toward the jury. We will show you that Thomas Bradshaw dedicated his life to helping others. 40 years in social work. Countless families helped. Communities strengthened. Career of service. Does that sound like a cold-blooded killer? Or does it sound like a man who's being scapegoated because law enforcement needs someone to blame? Carla's voice softened. Aurora Kelly's death was a tragedy. Her family deserves answers. But convicting an innocent man doesn't honor her memory. It compounds the tragedy. When you've heard all the evidence, you'll have reasonable doubt. And under our system of justice, reasonable doubt means you must acquit. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks. James Liu called witness after witness, building a comprehensive portrait of Aurora Kelly's final weeks and Thomas Bradshaw's behavior during that time. Jessica Morrison, Aurora's former roommate, testified about the conversation they'd had approximately 1 week before Aurora disappeared. She was agitated, Jessica said from the witness stand. Her voice steady despite visible emotion. She kept pacing around our apartment, saying something about people who abuse their power. She mentioned seeing something inappropriate at her internship, but said she needed to be sure before reporting it officially. Did she mention anyone by name? James asked. No. She said she was going to confront this person first, give them a chance to do the right thing. I told her that sounded dangerous. She laughed it off and said she'd be careful. Under cross-examination, Carla Richardson pressed Jessica. You didn't actually hear Aurora mention Thomas Bradshaw by name, did you? No, but... Simple yes or no, please. Did Aurora Kelly ever specifically tell you she was planning to confront Thomas Bradshaw? Not by name, no. So she could have been talking about someone else entirely. Another supervisor, a colleague, anyone? Jessica's frustration was visible. It was clearly about her internship supervisor. Who else would it be? That's speculation, Ms. Morrison. Thank you. No further questions. Dorothy Kelly's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She took the stand wearing a navy dress and a necklace with Aurora's birthstone. Her hands shook as she was sworn in. James approached her gently. Mrs. Kelly, can you tell the jury about the last time you spoke with your daughter? Dorothy's voice was barely above a whisper. It was Monday, October 8, 2001. She called me in the evening. She sounded stressed, which wasn't like Aurora. She was usually so upbeat. What did she say? She asked me what I would do if I knew someone was doing something wrong, but telling the truth would hurt innocent people. I asked her what she was talking about. She said there was a difficult situation at work, that she'd discovered something troubling. Dorothy paused, tears streaming down her face. I told her to trust her gut. I told her the truth always matters, even when it's hard. Did she mention Thomas Bradshaw? Not by name, but she was only working at one place, Haven House, under his supervision. Where else would she be having problems? James nodded sympathetically. Mrs. Kelly, can you describe what the past 23 years have been like for you? Dorothy's composure cracked. Every day I wake up and remember she's gone. Every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary Tuesday I remember. I kept her room exactly as it was. I turned the porch light on every night. Even though I knew she wasn't coming home. But I needed to do something. I needed her to know I was still looking, still hoping, still loving her. The courtroom was silent except for Dorothy's quiet weeping and the sound of several jurors reaching for tissues. Under cross-examination, Carla Richardson was respectful but probing. Mrs. Kelly, you have my sincere condolences for your loss. But I need to ask you some difficult questions. You never actually heard Aurora say Thomas Bradshaw's name in connection with these concerns. Correct. No, but it had to be about him. Had to be isn't the same as was. Is it? You're interpreting her words based on what you want to believe happened. James shot to his feet. Objection. Argumentative. Sustained. Judge Martinez ruled. Rephrase, Ms. Richardson. Carla nodded. Mrs. Kelly, isn't it possible Aurora was concerned about something or someone else entirely? I suppose anything's possible, Dorothy admitted. But my daughter was about to report someone for misconduct, and then she was murdered. That's not a coincidence. The DNA evidence came next. Dr. Sarah Brennan, a forensic DNA analyst from the state lab, testified about the MVAC system and how it had extracted usable DNA profiles from fabric fibers that had been considered too degraded to test using 2001 technology. The fibers came from Aurora Kelly's bedroom, Dr. Brennan explained, using diagrams to show the jury. They were consistent with a wool blend jacket. Using the MVAC system, which uses sterile saline solution to flush DNA from fabric at a cellular level, we were able to extract a complete DNA profile. That profile matched Thomas Bradshaw with a probability of 99.99999%. James displayed the statistical analysis. Can you explain what this probability means in practical terms? It means the likelihood of this DNA belonging to anyone other than Thomas Bradshaw is approximately 1 in 8 trillion. For context, there are only about 8 billion people on Earth. Under cross-examination, the defense's DNA expert, Dr. Robert Chen from a private forensic laboratory, raised questions about contamination and transfer. Dr. Brennan, isn't it possible that these fibers were transferred to Aurora's apartment through innocent contact? For example, during a supervision meeting? Transfer is possible, Dr. Brennan acknowledged. But the location of the fibers is significant. They were found in her bedroom on her bedside table, not in common areas where a supervisor might have been during a professional meeting. But you can't tell us when those fibers were deposited, can you? They could have been there for weeks, months even. The timeline can't be determined from DNA alone, no. Detective Marcus Chen's testimony walked the jury through the entire investigation, from the cold case reopening to the genealogical database search to the moment of arrest. He explained how familial DNA searching had identified potential relatives of the unknown suspect, how he'd built a family tree, how that tree had led to Thomas Bradshaw. When did you first suspect Thomas Bradshaw? James asked. December 2023, when the genealogical consultant identified him as a possible match. But suspicion isn't enough. We needed confirmation, which is why we obtained a warrant for his DNA. And how did you obtain that sample? Surveillance of Mr. Bradshaw's daily routine. We observed him purchasing coffee at a local cafe and disposing of the cup in a public trash receptacle. That cup and the DNA on it became evidence under the abandoned property doctrine. The defense attacked the genealogical database search as an invasion of privacy, but Judge Martinez had already ruled it admissible, and Marcus's testimony held firm. Then came the pattern evidence. Yolanda Martinez testified about Thomas Bradshaw's behavior toward Aurora and other female interns and clients. He had favorites, she said. Young, attractive women who he'd pay extra attention to. Aurora was definitely one of them. He'd call her into his office multiple times a week for supervision. But other interns barely saw their supervisors except for required meetings. He'd talk about her constantly. How bright she was, how dedicated, how special. Did this concern you? James asked. Yes. It seemed inappropriate. I mentioned it to the assistant director at the time, but nothing was done. Tom was senior staff, very respected. I was just a case manager. David Park, Aurora's academic advisor, testified about their October 8th meeting and shared his notes about her concerns regarding Bradshaw's inappropriate behavior with clients. Several former Haven House clients gave limited testimony about boundary violations they'd experienced, though their testimony was heavily restricted by Judge Martinez to avoid unfair prejudice. The conference alibi became a battleground. The defense called multiple witnesses who'd seen Thomas Bradshaw in San Antonio that weekend: conference attendees, hotel staff, restaurant servers. They testified that Bradshaw had been present at sessions, meals, and evening socials throughout Saturday and Sunday. But the prosecution countered with timeline analysis. Aurora had been seen by a neighbor at her apartment complex on Saturday morning at approximately 10 a.m., watering plants on her balcony. Her car had been in its parking space all weekend. Her phone records showed no outgoing calls after Friday evening. The prosecution theorized that Bradshaw had killed Aurora on Friday evening before leaving for the conference, or that he'd left the conference early Sunday, committed the murder, and returned before anyone noticed his absence. The conference was in San Antonio, approximately 90 miles from Bryan. James told the jury during his closing arguments, which came in mid-November after 3 weeks of testimony. That's less than 2 hours of drive time. Thomas Bradshaw could have left the conference at 5 a.m. Sunday morning, driven to Bryan, killed Aurora, disposed of her body, and returned by noon, before most attendees were even awake. Carla Richardson scoffed at this theory in her closing. The prosecution wants you to believe my client snuck away from a conference, drove to Bryan, committed a carefully planned murder, disposed of a body in a remote ravine, cleaned up all evidence, and returned to the conference with no one noticing his absence. That's not reasonable doubt. That's reasonable impossibility. The jury deliberated for 6 days. Each day, Dorothy Kelly sat on a bench outside the courtroom, surrounded by family and supporters. Ellen Bradshaw sat on the opposite side of the hallway with Rachel and a small group of church members who still believed in Thomas's innocence. The two groups never spoke to each other. Marcus Chun paced the courthouse corridors, second-guessing every decision, every piece of evidence, every witness. Had they done enough? Had they proved it beyond reasonable doubt? On the 6th day, at 3:47 p.m. on November 20th, 2024, the jury sent word they'd reached a verdict. The courtroom filled within minutes. Judge Martinez instructed everyone to remain calm regardless of the verdict. Thomas Bradshaw stood between his attorneys, his face pale. Dorothy Kelly gripped the hands of her sister and her niece, praying silently. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Martinez asked. The foreperson, the retired postal worker, stood. We have, Your Honor. What say you? In the case of the state of Texas versus Thomas Bradshaw, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Ellen Bradshaw screamed, "No!" Rachel collapsed against her husband. Dorothy Kelly sobbed, 23 years of grief pouring out in waves. Thomas Bradshaw's face went blank, as if his mind had simply left his body. Judge Martinez banged her gavel repeatedly. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. It took 10 minutes for calm to be restored. Thomas Bradshaw was remanded into custody pending sentencing, which was scheduled for January 2025. As deputies handcuffed him, he turned to his family one last time. I'm sorry, he said, though whether he was apologizing for what he'd done or for what they were enduring was unclear. Dorothy Kelly stood in the courthouse hallway afterward, surrounded by reporters and cameras. She'd prepared no statement. She'd thought she would feel triumphant, vindicated. Instead, she felt exhausted and hollow. Aurora would be 47 years old today, Dorothy said, her voice hoarse from crying. She'd have a career, maybe a family. She'd have made this world better. Thomas Bradshaw stole all of that from her, and from me. But at least now, after 23 years, we have the truth. At least now, she can rest. Detective Marcus Chun stood beside her, and he thought about the photograph he'd been staring at all those months ago when the DNA results came through. Aurora at 23, forever young, forever full of potential. Justice had come, but it felt less like victory and more like the closing of an old wound that had never properly healed. The sentencing hearing took place on January 15, 2025, 3 months after the guilty verdict. Texas law required a separate proceeding for punishment in capital cases, and while the prosecution wasn't seeking the death penalty due to the passage of time and lack of aggravating factors, they were asking for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was less crowded than it had been during the trial, but the atmosphere was no less intense. Thomas Bradshaw, now 65 years old, had aged dramatically during his months in county jail. His hair had gone completely white. He'd lost weight. The confident professional persona that had carried him through 4 decades in social work had crumbled, leaving behind something hollow and broken. The prosecution called several witnesses to speak about the impact of Aurora's murder. Dorothy Kelly, now 72, walked slowly to the witness stand with the help of her sister. The 3 months since the verdict had not been kind to her. The relief of justice had been real but temporary, replaced by a profound exhaustion that came from carrying grief for more than 2 decades. "Your Honor," Dorothy began, her prepared statement shaking in her hands. "My daughter Aurora was murdered 23 years ago. For most of that time, I didn't know who took her from me. I didn't know why. I couldn't understand how someone could kill such a beautiful soul and just walk away, live their life, go to church, smile at people in the grocery store." She looked directly at Thomas Bradshaw, who sat between his attorneys, staring at the table. "You knew her. You supervised her. She trusted you. And when she tried to do the right thing, when she tried to hold you accountable for hurting vulnerable people, you killed her. You threw her away like garbage in that ravine. And then you went to her memorial service and hugged me and told me you'd do anything to help find who did this." Dorothy's voice broke. "You looked me in the eye and lied. For 23 years, you lied. You let me suffer. You let me hope she might still be alive somewhere, even when I knew in my heart she was gone. You are evil, Mr. Bradshaw, pure evil. And I hope you spend every remaining day of your life remembering what you did to my beautiful girl." Jessica Morrison testified about the ripple effects of Aurora's death. "I couldn't sleep for years after she disappeared," Jessica said. "I kept thinking about that conversation, about how I told her she was being safe when clearly she wasn't. I dropped out of the social work program. I couldn't do it anymore. Aurora was supposed to change the world, and instead, the world broke her. And we all broke a little bit too." Dr. Helen Reeves, now 75, testified about the impact on the counseling community. "Aurora's death created a chilling effect. Students became afraid of their internships, of their supervisors. Trust, which is fundamental to this profession, was damaged. We had to completely revamp our oversight procedures, our safety protocols. But beyond the practical changes, there was something spiritual that was lost. Aurora believed in the possibility of human goodness. She believed people could heal. Mr. Bradshaw proved that sometimes the predators are the ones we're taught to trust." The defense called character witnesses for Bradshaw. His daughter Rachel testified through tears about her father's role in her life, how he'd coached her soccer team, helped her with homework, walked her down the aisle at her wedding. "I don't know who this person is that everyone's talking about," Rachel said. "The man I know is kind and gentle. He's my dad. I don't understand how this happened." Ellen Bradshaw, now estranged from most of her friends and family, testified about their 37 years of marriage. "Tom was a good husband," she said quietly. "A good father, a good man, or so I thought. I don't know what to believe anymore. Part of me still thinks there's been a mistake. But the DNA, I don't know. I just don't know." Pastor David Wilson testified about Bradshaw's 20 years of service to First Baptist Church. "Tom taught Sunday school. He led mission trips. He visited sick congregation members in the hospital. He lived what appeared to be a life of faith and service. If he's guilty of this crime, then I failed, we all failed, to see the darkness hiding beneath that facade." Thomas Bradshaw declined to speak on his own behalf, on the advice of his attorneys. He sat silently while victim impact statements were read, while character witnesses tried to salvage some fragment of his reputation. While the prosecution painted a picture of calculated evil hiding behind professional credentials and community standing. In her final argument for sentencing, Prosecutor James Liu stood before Judge Martinez with a folder containing photographs of Aurora Kelly at various stages of her life. Your Honor, the defendant stole Aurora Kelly's future. She'll never celebrate her 50th birthday. She'll never have children or grandchildren. She'll never open Phoenix House, the counseling center she dreamed of creating. Every bit of good she could have done in this world was taken by the defendant in an act of selfish violence designed to hide his own misconduct. James's voice hardened. He didn't just kill Aurora Kelly. He killed the possibility of her. He killed the hundreds or thousands of people she could have helped during a 40-year career in social work. He killed her mother's hope, her friends' trust in the world, the profession's sense of safety. The appropriate sentence is life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Carla Richardson, in her argument for leniency, asked Judge Martinez to consider Bradshaw's age, his lack of prior criminal history, and his 4 decades of service to vulnerable populations. Whatever happened that night in October 2001, and we maintain there are unanswered questions about this conviction. My client is not the same person he was 23 years ago. He's an elderly man with significant health problems. Life without parole is effectively a death sentence. Judge Martinez took less than 20 minutes to deliberate. When she returned to the bench, her expression was grave. Mr. Bradshaw, you've been convicted of murdering Aurora Kelly, a young woman who trusted you, who looked to you for guidance and mentorship. The evidence shows you killed her to protect yourself, to hide your misconduct. You then participated in the investigation, attended her memorial, and lived freely while her family suffered unimaginable grief. The judge paused, looking directly at Bradshaw. The law allows me some discretion in sentencing, but the facts of this case demand the maximum penalty. You are sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in custody of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Thomas Bradshaw's face remained impassive. He was led away in shackles, and as he left the courtroom for the last time as a free man passing through, Dorothy Kelly watched him go, feeling not triumph but a deep, bone-weary relief. It was over. After 8,492 days of not knowing, of hoping, of suffering, it was finally over. In the weeks following the sentencing, Bryan, Texas began the slow process of healing and reckoning with what had happened. The community had been fractured by the revelation that someone they trusted, respected, and elevated had been a murderer hiding in plain sight for more than 2 decades. First Baptist Church held a special service dedicated to truth and accountability. Pastor David Wilson delivered a sermon that was part confession, part lament. We failed Aurora Kelly, he told the congregation of 300 people, many with tears streaming down their faces. We failed to see what was in front of us. We elevated Thomas Bradshaw to positions of leadership and trust without asking hard questions. We confused professional credentials with moral character. We were complicit through our blindness. The sermon sparked difficult conversations throughout the church. Some members felt it was too harsh, that they couldn't have known what Bradshaw was hiding. Others felt it didn't go far enough, that the church needed to examine its entire culture of protecting powerful men and dismissing women's concerns. The church split over the controversy, with about 40% of the congregation leaving to form or join other churches. Those who remained committed to a complete overhaul of their safeguarding policies and leadership accountability structures. Haven House, the family counseling center where Aurora had interned and where Thomas Bradshaw had worked for 12 years, faced an existential crisis. The scandal had devastated their reputation and funding. Major donors pulled their support. Clients transferred to other agencies. Staff members resigned, either from shame, anger, or fear of being associated with the organization. Jennifer Walsh, the current director, called an emergency board meeting in February 2025 to discuss the organization's future. The meeting was held in the same conference room where Aurora Kelly had once attended case consultations and staff meetings, back when she was a bright-eyed intern with dreams of changing the world. We have 3 options, Jennifer told the board. We can close our doors, declaring organizational bankruptcy, both financial and moral. We can rebrand entirely, change our name, and try to distance ourselves from this history. Or we can face what happened. Aurora Kelly, a 23-year-old graduate social work student at Texas A&M University, disappeared on October 15, 2001, after confronting her supervisor Thomas Bradshaw about ethical violations. Her body was discovered in a wooded area, and the case went cold for 2 decades until DNA technology linked Bradshaw to her murder in 2021. He was convicted in 2024 and sentenced to life imprisonment, dying in prison in 2037 while maintaining his innocence. Aurora's mother Dorothy kept a porch light burning for 8,492 nights, over 23 years, awaiting her daughter's return. When justice finally arrived, Dorothy transformed her grief into purpose, volunteering with victim advocacy organizations and facilitating support groups for mothers who'd lost children to violence until her death in 2032. The revelation of Bradshaw's crimes nearly destroyed Haven House, the social services organization where both he and Aurora had worked. Rather than closing or rebranding, the board chose accountability. They restructured operations completely, implementing mandatory training on power dynamics, creating an independent oversight committee, and establishing the annual Aurora Kelly Memorial Lecture on Ethics. Texas A&M School of Social Work established the Aurora Kelly Scholarship for students committed to trauma-informed care and ethical practice. The Aurora Kelly Center for Ethics in Social Work Practice was created to provide training and research on professional boundaries and accountability. These institutions became nationally recognized models. The Texas State Board of Social Work Examiners conducted a comprehensive review revealing 2 previous informal complaints against Bradshaw in the 1990s that had been inadequately addressed through educational remediation. The board implemented sweeping policy changes requiring formal investigations for allegations involving sexual or romantic relationships with clients and mandatory reporting to law enforcement. Thomas Bradshaw's family struggled with his conviction. His daughter Rachel visited him monthly in prison for years, torn between the DNA evidence and her memories of a loving father. His wife Ellen divorced him and moved to Arizona. Their grandchildren grew up knowing their grandfather only as an imprisoned man. Rachel's daughter Emma, however, chose a remarkable path. At 22, she applied for a social work internship at Haven House itself, openly acknowledging her grandfather's crimes. Despite the controversy, she was accepted and eventually became Dr. Emma Bradshaw Martinez after being adopted by Yolanda Martinez, Haven House's clinical director who had spoken truth about Bradshaw's misconduct. Emma spent her career transforming her grandfather's betrayal into systemic change. She became an associate professor at Boston University and authored Repairing the Breach: Accountability and Transformation in Helping Professions, a groundbreaking work that examined cases like Aurora's and outlined necessary systemic changes. The Haven House model, featuring independent oversight, transparent complaint handling, regular ethical consultation, and survivor-centered accountability, was adopted by social service organizations nationwide and internationally. By 2050, delegations from 15 countries were visiting to learn from their framework. A PBS documentary titled Broken Trust: The Aurora Kelly Story sparked national conversations about power dynamics in helping professions. Maria Gonzalez, a former client of Bradshaw's who'd experienced boundary violations but had been too afraid to testify, spoke publicly about her experience, helping to illuminate how predators operate within professional settings. The Aurora Kelly Award for Ethical Courage became a national honor recognizing social workers who demonstrated extraordinary courage in holding colleagues or institutions accountable for misconduct despite personal risk. The first recipient was Dr. Michael Torres, who'd exposed widespread abuse at a residential treatment facility despite losing his job and facing retaliation. Emma Bradshaw Martinez died in 2075 at age 92, having spent 70 years standing in the gap between what is and what should be, transforming her family's shame into the profession's transformation. By the centennial of Aurora's death in 2101, her story had become foundational to social work education globally. The Aurora Kelly Center had expanded to 15 states. The Award for Ethical Courage had been presented to 276 social workers. Haven House had evolved into the Aurora Kelly Institute for Ethical Practice, operating in 40 countries and training hundreds of thousands of professionals annually. The 2100 Centennial Symposium featured a powerful panel of 3 great-grandchildren. Dr. Marcus Chin, great-grandson of the detective who solved the case, Dr. Isabel Morrison, great-granddaughter of Aurora's roommate Jessica, and Lily Bradshaw, great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Bradshaw. Lily, like Emma before her, had chosen to reclaim the Bradshaw name and become a social worker, demonstrating that descendants can transform inherited shame into accountability and service. Dorothy Kelly's house on Broadmoor Drive became a historic landmark, with the porch light still burning every night, no longer from desperate hope, but as sacred commitment and community remembrance. The cost of courage. Aurora died at 23 trying to hold someone accountable for harming others. Her story illustrates that doing the right thing can be dangerous, yet remaining silent enables predators and betrays professional values. The long arc of justice. Justice took 23 years, arriving too late to spare decades of suffering but eventually arriving nonetheless. Detective Marcus Chen's persistence demonstrated that time doesn't erase truth. Science advances. Witnesses eventually speak. Secrets emerge. Institutional accountability. Haven House's decision to face its failures rather than rebrand or close became a model for how organizations can reckon with harmful histories. Hiding from history means repeating it. Facing history means learning from it. Intergenerational redemption. Emma and Lily Bradshaw's choices show that descendants of those who cause harm can choose accountability over denial, can transform family shame into professional integrity, and can honor victims through service rather than silence. Transformation through tragedy. Aurora's death catalyzed changes that have protected countless vulnerable people across a century. This doesn't make her murder acceptable or redemptive, but it means her life and courage weren't wasted. The persistence of memory. From Dorothy's porch light burning for 8,492 nights to the Centennial Memorial Service, the story demonstrates how communities choose what to remember and how that remembrance shapes values across generations. The narrative concludes with thousands of candles lit at the Centennial Service, embodying the central metaphor. Some lights, once kindled by genuine courage, can never be extinguished. They simply wait for others to pick them up and carry them forward into whatever darkness remains. Aurora Kelly, a 23-year-old graduate social work student at Texas A&M University, disappeared on October 15, 2001, after confronting her supervisor Thomas Bradshaw about ethical violations. Her body was discovered in a wooded area, and the case went cold for 2 decades until DNA technology linked Bradshaw to her murder in 2021. He was convicted in 2024 and sentenced to life imprisonment, dying in prison in 2037 while maintaining his innocence. Aurora's mother Dorothy kept a porch light burning for 8,492 nights, over 23 years, awaiting her daughter's return. When justice finally arrived, Dorothy transformed her grief into purpose, volunteering with victim advocacy organizations and facilitating support groups for mothers who'd lost children to violence until her death in 2032. The investigation that finally solved the case was led by Detective Marcus Chen, who reopened the cold case in 2021 when advances in DNA technology made it possible to extract usable profiles from degraded evidence. The DNA found under Aurora's fingernails matched Thomas Bradshaw's, providing the definitive proof that had eluded investigators for 2 decades. The trial in 2024 revealed the full extent of Bradshaw's misconduct. Boundary violations with multiple vulnerable female clients, obsessive behavior toward Aurora, and ultimately murder to silence her attempts to report him. The revelation of Bradshaw's crimes nearly destroyed Haven House, the social services organization where both he and Aurora had worked. The organization faced a crisis of legitimacy. Funding dried up, clients left, staff resigned, and the community questioned whether the organization should continue to exist. The board debated 3 paths: closing entirely, rebranding under a new name, or facing the failures directly and rebuilding with transparency. Rather than closing or rebranding, the board chose accountability. Led by Yolanda Martinez, who'd been promoted to clinical director after speaking truth about Bradshaw's misconduct, they voted 6-4 to keep Haven House open under the same name but to completely restructure operations. They hired outside consultants to conduct comprehensive reviews, implemented mandatory training on power dynamics and boundary violations, and created an independent oversight committee that included community members and former clients. Most symbolically, they commissioned a bronze plaque installed in the reception area honoring Aurora's memory and establishing a new organizational culture where speaking truth to power is safe, supported, and sacred. They also established the annual Aurora Kelly Memorial Lecture on Ethics in Social Work Practice, ensuring that every new generation of staff and interns would learn her story. Texas A&M School of Social Work established the Aurora Kelly Scholarship, providing full tuition plus living stipends, with preference for students from underserved communities committed to trauma-informed care and ethical practice. Dr. Helen Reeves, Aurora's faculty mentor, worked with the university to create the Aurora Kelly Center for Ethics in Social Work Practice, which offered training, research, and consultation on professional boundaries, power dynamics, and survivor-centered approaches to accountability. The center's dedication ceremony in April 2025 drew nearly 500 attendees. Dorothy Kelly spoke movingly about how the center transformed Aurora's stolen potential into opportunities for others, redirecting her daughter's lost future into helping future social workers develop the ethical frameworks Aurora had died defending. The Texas State Board of Social Work Examiners conducted a comprehensive review revealing that 2 informal complaints had been filed against Bradshaw in the 1990s, both involving alleged boundary violations with female clients. Neither complaint had resulted in formal investigation or discipline. Instead, complaints had been handled through educational remediation, essentially requiring Bradshaw to take an ethics course while allowing him to continue practicing. The board publicly acknowledged its failures and implemented sweeping policy changes, requiring formal investigations for any allegations involving sexual or romantic relationships with clients, mandatory reporting to law enforcement when appropriate, and eliminating the ability for licensees to resolve serious complaints through education alone. "We failed Aurora Kelly," the board president stated. "These policy changes won't bring her back, but they're our commitment to preventing future tragedies." The Aurora Kelly case captured national attention through true crime podcasts, documentary series, and news programs. However, rather than focusing solely on sensational aspects, much coverage emphasized the systemic issues her death revealed about power dynamics in helping professions. A 3-part PBS documentary titled Broken Trust, the Aurora Kelly story examined how institutions protect predators, the challenges of reporting misconduct, and the ways vulnerable people are silenced. The documentary featured interviews with Dorothy Kelly, Jessica Morrison, Aurora's roommate, Dr. Helen Reeves, and several women who'd been Bradshaw's clients and experienced boundary violations. Maria Gonzalez, who'd been too afraid to testify at trial, agreed to appear in the documentary using her real name and unblurred face. At 50, working as an office manager in Houston with 3 grown children, she'd spent decades blaming herself for not reporting Bradshaw earlier. Her on-camera testimony powerfully illustrated how predators exploit vulnerability and how victims are manipulated into silence. "For years I wondered if I should have reported him," Maria said. "If I had, maybe Aurora Kelly would still be alive. That guilt nearly destroyed me. But I've learned something through therapy and time. The person responsible for Aurora's death is Thomas Bradshaw. Not me. Not the other women he manipulated. Not Aurora herself for trying to hold him accountable. Him. Only him." The documentary sparked broader conversations about abuse in helping professions and led to legislative action in several states, including Texas, requiring more robust supervision and reporting structures for licensed professionals. Professional organizations updated ethics codes and enforcement procedures. Thomas Bradshaw's conviction devastated his family. His daughter Rachel visited him monthly in prison, caught between DNA evidence proving his guilt and childhood memories of a loving, principled father. His wife Ellen stopped visiting after 6 months, filed for divorce, and moved to Arizona to escape the stigma. Their grandchildren grew up knowing their grandfather only as someone behind bars. Rachel struggled with cognitive dissonance. How could the man who taught her to ride a bike, who devoted his career to helping people, be a murderer? Bradshaw maintained his innocence until his death, insisting the DNA evidence was somehow wrong, that the real killer remained free, that he'd been wrongly convicted. This persistent denial made closure impossible for his family. Rachel's daughter Emma, however, chose a remarkable and courageous path. At 22, the same age Aurora had been when she confronted Bradshaw, Emma applied for a social work internship at Haven House itself, openly acknowledging her grandfather's crimes. Her application raised immediate red flags, but Yolanda Martinez agreed to meet with her. "Why do you want to intern here?" Yolanda asked directly. "Because of Aurora Kelly," Emma responded. "Because of what my grandfather did to her. Because I need to understand how someone in this profession could betray its values so completely. And because I want to be part of healing that harm." Emma explained that she changed her last name at 13 when her mother tried to distance the family from the Bradshaw name, but she changed it back at 18. "I could have hidden who I am, applied under a different name, never mentioned the connection. But that felt like another betrayal. Aurora Kelly deserves better than more secrets and shame." Despite controversy and concerns about the impact on staff and clients, Emma was offered the internship with conditions: additional supervision, regular ethical consultations, and understanding that her placement might be terminated if too disruptive. She accepted, spending a year working in the same building where her grandfather had worked and Aurora had interned, where abuse had flourished and then been exposed. On her first day, Emma stood before Aurora's memorial plaque and whispered a promise. "I'll honor what you tried to do. I'll be the social worker my grandfather should have been." Emma was eventually adopted by Yolanda Martinez, taking the name Bradshaw Martinez, a symbolic fusion of her problematic heritage with her chosen mentor's guidance. She became Dr. Emma Bradshaw Martinez, earning her doctorate and becoming an associate professor at Boston University School of Social Work. Her career focused on professional ethics, accountability in helping professions, and how systems can prevent abuse of power. Her groundbreaking book, Repairing the Breach: Accountability and Transformation in Helping Professions, examined cases like Aurora's and outlined systemic changes needed to prevent similar tragedies. The book's dedication read, "For Aurora Kelly, whose courage speaks across decades, and for my grandfather Thomas, whose failures taught me what social work should never be." Emma visited her grandfather a week before his death from cancer in 2037. She made one final attempt to find acknowledgement, admission, closure. But Thomas maintained his innocence to the end. "I can't confess to something I didn't do. I know what the evidence says. I know what people believe. But I didn't kill her, Emma. I didn't." Emma learned to live with ambiguity. The DNA evidence said guilty, the jury convicted, but the grandfather she'd loved seemed incapable of murder. She concluded that whether he killed Aurora or was wrongly convicted, he had undeniably failed his profession, failed his supervisee, failed vulnerable clients. Those failures had cascading consequences across decades. By 2030, Haven House had stabilized and begun to thrive again. The organization implemented ethical rounds, weekly staff meetings to discuss difficult ethical situations, power dynamics, and boundary concerns. These confidential sessions, facilitated by outside consultants, created a culture where people felt safe raising concerns before they escalated into crises. "We're trying to do what Aurora wanted to do," Yolanda Martinez told a reporter. "She saw problems and wanted to address them. That courage got her killed. But her courage is also what's guiding us now. We ask ourselves constantly, what would Aurora do? What would honor her values?" The Haven House model, featuring independent oversight, transparent complaint handling, mandatory reporting structures, regular ethical consultation, survivor-centered accountability approaches, and community involvement, was adopted by social service organizations nationwide and internationally. By 2050, Haven House had become a model studied globally, with delegations from 15 countries visiting to learn from their framework. Dorothy Kelly's final years reflected her transformation from grieving mother to advocate and healer. She facilitated monthly support groups for mothers who'd lost children to violence, sharing her experience and offering the hard-won wisdom that grief changes shape but never disappears, that carrying grief alongside life is possible even when the pain never fully goes away. "Does it ever stop hurting?" a newly bereaved mother asked her. "No," Dorothy answered honestly, "but the hurt changes shape. Right now, your grief is everything. Eventually, it becomes something you carry with you rather than something you're drowning in. You'll laugh again. You'll enjoy things again. And then you'll feel guilty for enjoying things, and you'll have to learn that it's okay to be alive even though your child isn't. That's the hardest part. Dorothy died peacefully in 2032 at age 79, still clutching Aurora's graduation photo. Her funeral drew hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched through her advocacy work. She was buried next to Aurora under a joint headstone reading, Aurora Kelly 1978 to 2001 / Her Light Still Shines, and Dorothy Kelly 1952 to 2032 / She Kept the Light Burning. The Aurora Kelly Award for Ethical Courage became a national honor recognizing social workers who demonstrated extraordinary courage in holding colleagues or institutions accountable for misconduct despite personal risk. The first recipient in 2045 was Dr. Michael Torres, who'd exposed widespread abuse at a residential treatment facility for foster youth in California, losing his job and facing retaliation before a state investigation vindicated him. Aurora Kelly was 23 years old when she decided truth mattered more than safety, Torres said at the awards ceremony. I was 52 when I faced a similar choice. Much older, more established, with far more resources to protect myself. And still I was terrified. Still I wanted to look away. But I thought about Aurora. I thought about the cost of silence. And I spoke up. By 2050, 276 social workers had received the award, each demonstrating the courage to speak truth to power in circumstances where silence would have been safer, but would have allowed harm to continue. Emma Bradshaw Martinez died peacefully in 2075 at age 92, having spent 70 years transforming her grandfather's betrayal into systemic change. Her funeral at Haven House drew over 800 attendees. Her daughter Sarah spoke about her mother's complicated legacy and her determination to stand in the gap between what is and what should be, making hope real through 7 decades of ethical practice and advocacy. The Centennial Symposium in 2100 brought together scholars, practitioners, and advocates from around the world. The keynote address by Dr. Marcus Chen, great-grandson of the detective who solved the case, reflected on how Aurora's courage rippled across a century, creating ethical frameworks and accountability structures that had protected countless vulnerable people. The most powerful moment came during a panel featuring 3 great-grandchildren representing different aspects of the story. Dr. Marcus Chun, descendant of the detective, Dr. Isabel Morrison, descendant of Aurora's roommate Jessica, and Lily Bradshaw, great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Bradshaw. Lily, 28 and a social worker in Seattle, had reclaimed the Bradshaw name at 21, choosing transparency over hiding. I've struggled my entire life with what my great-great-grandfather did, she said. But whether he murdered Aurora or was wrongly convicted, he failed her as a supervisor and mentor. At minimum, he created an environment where a young social worker felt unsafe. At worst, he killed her. Either way, he betrayed every value our profession holds sacred. She continued, I'm a social worker because of Aurora Kelly, not because of Thomas Bradshaw. I believe the profession can be what it claims to be, a force for healing, justice, and human dignity. But that only happens when we face our failures honestly, when we create systems that protect vulnerable people instead of powerful predators, when we choose courage over comfort. The Centennial Memorial Service in 2101 drew thousands to Bryan's City Park. The mayor, herself a social work graduate who'd written her thesis on the Aurora Kelly case, spoke about how Aurora's courage continued to resonate. We gather not to celebrate her death, but to honor her life and recommit ourselves to the values she embodied: truth, compassion, accountability, and the radical belief that vulnerable people deserve protection more than powerful people deserve protection from consequences. As darkness fell, thousands lit candles, small flames flickering across the park, singing "This Little Light of Mine," which had become associated with Aurora's legacy. Meanwhile, on Broadmoor Drive, Dorothy Kelly's porch light burned steady and bright, as it had for a century, maintained by the Historical Preservation Society as a beacon transformed from desperate hope into enduring memory into sacred commitment. The narrative demonstrates that some lights, once kindled by genuine courage, can never be extinguished. They simply wait for others to pick them up and carry them forward into whatever darkness remains. a testament to how one person's refusal to remain silent can transform a profession, inspire generations, and prove that even in tragedy, courage creates lasting change. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.